Welcome, everyone. Somebody messaged me. Can everyone see and hear everything all right? Give a thumbs up if your video's on. All right, terrific. So, what you've all been waiting for, what do we do about this federal budget situation? Uh, I'm Nathan Gusdorf. I am the executive director of the Fiscal Policy Institute. FPI, if you're not familiar with us, is a state tax and budget think tank. We've been around since 1991. We work closely with legislators, labor unions, advocates, and other policy experts, and we try to be a really essential resource for the press when it comes to all manner of state and city tax, budget, and economic policy issues. This is obviously an unusual time, really, in the history of state fiscal policy, because we have pretty unprecedented reductions in federal aid to the state that creates budget pressures. We have had so many crises in the past that cause temporary reductions in federal funding, but this looks like it may be more of a long-term situation. And so that calls for long-term solutions, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Um, my email is just my last name at fiscalpolicy.org. You can also find our materials on our website, fiscalpolicy.org, and you can contact the org account at info@fiscalpolicy. So if you ever have questions, if you're ever looking for something, if you've got a problem you're working on and you'd like to chat with us, please do reach out. And with that said, here's what's on the agenda for today. First, I'm just going to give an overview of this new federal budget legislation known as the One Big Beautiful Budget Act, or One Big Beautiful Bill Act, rather. That was really covered in depth last week, but I'm going to go through some of the high-level content just so that we're sure everyone's on the same page. Then we're going to talk about what legislators can actually do to respond to this, and how to think about the tax and revenue options that are meaningfully on the table. All right, so what's actually in this OBBBA for New York? This is somewhat complex chart, so I'm not going to really get into all the details. If you want to know, that's what we published on last week. But it does show you all of the big fiscal costs, both to the state budget and to the state's healthcare system, which actually all sort of play out a bit separately. So the biggest drivers of budgetary problems for the state are really in health insurance and in food stamps. These first two rows about the essential plan, that is basically an ACA-related Medicaid-like expansion of health insurance for people who are low income, but not low enough income to qualify for Medicaid. That's really federally funded. And one of the targets of this new federal budget legislation for cost savings is immigrants who get tax subsidies for health insurance. Not undocumented immigrants, lawful immigrants, including green card holders. But that's going to cost the state $2.7 billion. And that actually reflects the state's own responsibility to put those people on Medicaid. There are also some temporary funding streams that the Trump administration is going to roll back under this legislation. It's called an MCO tax. We've written that up in detail if you're curious, but the impact is about $1.5 billion. There are also, if you're following the federal budget situation, you know that one of the ways to cut down on the costs of these spending programs is to impose work requirements. It costs a fair amount of money to impose those work requirements. Someone has to create the paperwork and administer it. And so between Medicaid and food stamps, that's going to be about $750 million. The state is going to be responsible for paying part of SNAP, which is another $1 billion. And then there are other cuts basically to not the sort of core Medicaid funding stream, but other funding streams that help hospitals sustain themselves because they're treating the sort of large population of people who are uninsured or have health insurance that pays relatively low reimbursements. So just on the state budget side, it's about a $10 billion hit. And that's kind of the number to have in your head as we go through the what to do about it set of questions. There are other costs that are detailed here that are healthcare system-wide costs. Those are very concerning, but in the first instance, they're not the budgetary issue. So it's sort of a related but somewhat separate problem to think about. This just gives you a sense of the timeline. Again, if you're reading about this in the press, you'll have seen that the state's own estimate is that this year, meaning this state fiscal year, which just started and ends in March of next year, they think there's a $750 million cost from these cuts. That might sound like a lot of money for the state government. It's not really a lot of money. That's pretty manageable. This shows you how we expect it to play out over the coming 5 years. So basically, as more components of the federal legislation come into play, and some of them basically work on delay. So as they start to take effect after those delays, it'll really amount to like a $6 to $8 billion annual cost to the state in terms of annual cuts. All right, so what do you actually do about any of this? The basic answer is sort of twofold. The governor and the legislature have the power to call an extraordinary legislative session where they could redo the budget, they could impose new taxes, they could negotiate how to implement spending reductions, what have you. Many people in the advocacy world think that's a really good idea. We think there's a lot of merit to it. The challenge right now in calling an extraordinary session would be that, as I just said, this year's funding reductions are not so serious that they require major new budgetary decisions. Once we get into the beginning of next year and we're in budget season, there will be very serious funding issues that get negotiated. The logic to doing it now would be that it's both better to move quickly and better to do it before all those funding cuts actually are actively coming down the pipeline. But that's really the only mechanism by which you can holistically respond to this scale of fiscal challenges. The challenges that we're actually likely to see, or what the state has estimated this current year $750 million cost, people will say that that's still too much to handle and something has to get cut. The state has $31 billion in reserve. This is a good example of something to use the reserves for. So in terms of kind of current year activity, we really should expect not to see any big funding reductions. And to the extent any are proposed, they should be pretty soundly rejected because the state has the ability to manage them. But it is not too early to start figuring out what to do with the structural challenges because at the latest, we'll all have to be debating them in 6 to 8 months. There is one other thing that's kind of worth noting here, which is that this past budget gave the governor extraordinary, unusual powers to basically withhold spending in the event of a shortfall over $2 billion. That was really structured to look like it relates to a recession and a decline in tax revenues, but we think that it could easily be triggered by significant federal funding cuts that increase the state's own spending liabilities. However, it looks like they're not actually going to hit the targets needed to cause those powers to come into play. So our best guess is that this does not get triggered this year. Those powers only arise if there's a more than a $2 billion shortfall. And so that's kind of their understanding of what is a kind of manageable gap for them to handle without really shifting around spending. All right, now into the sort of meat of it, beyond emergency powers and what to do immediately, I think it's really important to zoom out here and see that we have basically entered into pretty much a wholly new tax policy landscape. And that means that it's important to understand not just the spending cuts that are in this new federal budget legislation, but what the structure of the tax cuts is and how it has led to the current situation we're in. We need to think about who benefits, which taxes are being cut, and how that helps us understand New York State's own economy and capacity to finance social spending. All right, so this new budget legislation, it's called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Importantly, it cut taxes well, it actually didn't cut taxes, but it extended tax cuts for most taxpayers. You may have heard conflicting accounts. Is it preventing a middle-class tax hike? Is it giving tax cuts to billionaires? There's a little bit of truth to all of these claims that seem to compete that people say about the bill. What's very clear is these are mostly deficit financed tax cuts. So even though we're very concerned about all these spending reductions that are flowing through to the state, that reflects $1.2 trillion in total spending cuts. But mostly this whole package was deficit financed at a cost of $3.4 trillion over the next 10 years, which is the conventional forecasting window that they use for estimating these costs. This is actually fairly meaningful in historical perspective because it really is a kind of new installment of what has been the Republican Party's tax policy strategy going back to the first Reagan administration, when the top income tax rate was cut from 70% to 50%, and it really started what has now been a kind of multi-generational strategy of deficit financing tax cuts. In this particular case, it goes back to 2017. This was really the one kind of big policy victory of the first Trump administration. It was a really large set of tax cuts known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was estimated to increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion. And the big provisions were a really large cut to the federal corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, income tax rates pretty much across the board for almost all taxpayers, alongside all these special business provisions, like creating a special deduction for the owners of pass-through businesses, and rather notoriously limiting the individual income tax deduction for state and local taxes at the federal level. We'll talk a little bit more about why all this matters, but it is helpful to understand how the whole tax landscape is shifting. The issue that the political time bomb here was that all of these tax cuts, other than the federal corporate tax cut, were passed under the reconciliation rules, which means that they were set to expire at the end of this year. So essentially, the Republicans painted themselves into a corner where you had trillions of dollars of what would have been tax increases because all those tax cuts would have expired, but they were not really prepared to make the spending cuts needed to balance, I mean, not really balance the budget, but to partly balance out some of those tax cut extensions. So you really have to sort of see it as the long-term outcome of this sort of fiscally unstable tax cut strategy that goes back to the early 1980s. Because the economy grows and people's incomes generally rise, the cost of those tax cuts changes over time. So even though the first set of imbalanced tax cuts cost about $1.5 trillion in deficit financing, this year when they went to extend it, it turned into a $4.5 trillion cost. That's before you offset it with other spending cuts or other revenue raisers. So you should really see this kind of gap growing between federal revenues and federal expenditures, which is interesting in its own right, but it's important for our purposes because it really tells you that this is only the first sort of installment in what's going to be a structural problem in social policy in the United States. And so states are, like individual states, are going to have to choose between taking on the measures that are needed to fill those funding gaps or just kind of letting these legislative maneuvers wreak havoc on social policy all over the country. I'm not going to get deep into the weeds of why all that matters, but it's fairly intuitive. I mean, most countries have built, even in the United States, moderately strong welfare systems going back over 100 years because people understand that if you have widespread health uninsurance, if you have rising unemployment, if people are hungry and poor and face housing insecurity, it's both inhumane and it really is sort of a threat to the economic health of the economy for working and middle income families. So if you buy that argument, then now is the time to recognize that the states are really going to have to step up and do what they can to fill gaps and make sure that these services are sustainable. So where those two pieces come together is I'm going to talk about revenue raisers and how to come up with the money needed to sustain these programs, but I'm not really going to tell a story about how the rich or the super rich are too rich and they made out like bandits. Because the reality of this bill is that even though it does give tax benefits to the very well off, as I'll talk about, they're really sort of spread all over the place. And in particular, they kind of benefit the middle and upper middle income groups. So the costliest provision of the whole bill, over half of the cost of all the tax cut extensions, was just reducing income tax rates for all brackets. Again, disproportionately benefits those at the top, but it's really across the board. The next thing, which you've only heard about if you're a tax professional, is an exemption from the alternative minimum tax, which is a sort of federal mechanism to make sure that people don't engage in excessive tax planning and lower their federal income taxes more than I guess Congress agrees on. So by the Tax Policy Center's estimate, that used to cover about 7.5 million taxpayers, and these bills increased the exemption floor so that it shrunk to really only covering 200,000 taxpayers. So those two provisions together account for actually most of the cost of these tax cuts. But the other thing that's pretty egregious and on a comparable scale is basically a special deduction for owners of pass-through businesses. A pass-through business is any sort of non-corporate business. So if you know about S corporations, partnerships, LLCs, those businesses don't pay the corporate tax, so they didn't benefit from the corporate tax cut in the 2017 Act. And so they sort of got this weird parity tax cut. It really doesn't make any sense, but it's basically all those people as individuals just pay a lot less tax because they're business owners now instead of salaried employees. The other thing I wanted to include here was the sort of like in a way flashiest tax cuts in this package were reducing taxes on overtime, car loan interest, which is crazy, the no taxes on tips. Those are basically limited deductions, and they do cost real money, but it's just not. It's sort of a small part of the overall cost. So the map you should have in your head of what's going on here is really kind of across the board tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the very rich, but benefit a little bit most people kind of who are maybe above the 30th percentile or so. One thing that we should walk through also is the notorious SALT cap. This shows you that there are some revenue raisers included on the tax side. So there are Medicaid cuts as well as other measures to increase tax revenue, about $500 billion cut out of clean energy credits, and most famously, about $800 billion expected to be raised from limiting the state and local tax deduction for, well, formerly it was for everyone. Now there's going to be a little benefit. I'll work through it in a minute. But the sort of consequence for us is any rich person is now complaining about the limitation of the SALT deduction. So you might think that because that was a big revenue raiser in the package, that they are worse off after the implementation of all these tax cuts. That would not be the case. Overall, they are still getting an income tax cut. It's just that typically if you cut somebody's taxes and then also raise them a little bit, people kind of take the tax cut for granted and get really mad about the tax increase. This shows you the distribution. So again, everybody gets a little tax cut, but the nature of a tax cut is that it tends to overwhelmingly benefit those who pay more in tax, which goes back to some of that core social policy logic that you really need a sort of society-wide taxes that are progressive to fund social programs. And there's some sleight of hand in suggesting to people who are very middle income that they get $1,000 in tax cuts and they should be happy because they're really going to bear the brunt of all the sort of harmful spending reductions when their family members or friends lose their health insurance, or they lose their health insurance, or they have to deal with the hunger and housing insecurity of people in their community. So to that point, this shows you the 1 year cost of the tax cuts. It's about $570 billion estimated for 2027 when most of the stuff is fully phased in. And as you can see, of that tax cost, almost $400 billion is going to benefit the top 20%, which is basically households that make over $150,000. The sort of smaller share of the benefit goes to that fourth quintile, people in the sort of 60th to 80th percentile. But anybody who's excited about, who's middle income, who's excited about the tax cuts, they're really getting a tiny share of the cost of this whole package. So really the money is being spent to benefit the well-off. Again, not the super rich, but people who are relatively well off. If you look at it on a per household basis, you also see kind of how extreme that disparity is. Again, just because the rich, they earn more income, so they pay more tax. But the per household benefit of these rate reductions is very, very significant if you're in the top 1% to 2%, say, and you're earning around $1 million a year. And we have a large population of those $1 million income earners, or sort of 1% to 2%ers, as it were, in New York. Right, that translates into about an $80,000 annual benefit from these tax cuts if you're in that top 1% population. If you're in the population that's excited about the middle income tax cuts, it's not nothing, but it's on the order of $1,000 to $2,000 per year. It's not really where the money is going in driving the cost of this package of tax cuts. And then in thinking through what the numbers are, if you're curious about the sort of tax rates, which is often how these debates go, people thinking about the tax rates and what's an unfair tax rate. This shows you the net effect, and it also kind of goes back to that point about the SALT deduction. Even though people are unhappy about it, it sort of gets swamped by the overall rate reduction. So in our high income earning groups here, this is an effective, so the top marginal tax rates decrease. So the top federal income tax bracket for a married household is people who make over $750,000 a year. And the marginal rate has decreased from 39.6% to 37%. But this is an estimate by the Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation of the effective tax rate, which will make sense if you understand marginal tax rates, and if you don't, just don't worry about it. So if you're sort of earning over $500,000 a year, this whole package translates into a 3% to 4% effective tax rate reduction, which that should be interesting both as a matter of basic tax fairness, but in terms of the point of this presentation, that starts to tell you something about fiscal space for the state. So if you wanted to raise income taxes in the state of New York by even 1%, you'd hear all the conventional counter arguments that taxes are too high and people will leave and they can't go any higher. And if you compare our taxes to, Ohio, it's really unfair. And all of those arguments are going to neglect to acknowledge the fact that all of these top earners are getting a really substantial tax cut at the federal level. And there's something important to know about the SALT cap, even in addition to what I've been telling you. So first, it is just, in the first instance, it is pretty consequential as a limitation. It used to be that you could deduct unlimited state and local taxes, and if you're in that top 1% population in New York, you're likely paying over $100,000 of state and local taxes. You used to be able to deduct all of that from your federal income tax, which would have a benefit of at least about $30,000 to you, and that would give you a little bit of comfort, maybe as to paying your blue state higher taxes. The political logic of that 2017 tax bill was to stick it to blue states, even the high earners who disproportionately vote Republican, and sort of make them suffer for being in a higher tax state. But a lot of that effect was kind of obviated because states found something they called the SALT workaround, which essentially allows people who are business owners, and most people in this income group are a business owner, a partner in a law firm or an investment firm, or they own their own business. It's maybe a little bit smaller, but high income yielding. And you can basically pay an optional tax to the state, deduct it on your federal taxes, and then get it rebated to you against your personal income tax. Uh, Without worrying too much about the details, that pretty much cancels out the effect of that SALT cap at the federal level. And every year, about $16 billion of that optional tax are paid in order to get around the SALT cap just in New York. And 90% of the benefit of that optional tax, that PTET, really goes to households that are earning over $500,000. So this further undermines even what was some of the revenue raising side of the federal legislation. So with that in mind, you've got really substantial tax cuts. You should think of that as opening up fiscal space, as creating room for the state to fill. But now we have to focus on what it means for New York specifically. And in particular, we have to think about it because a lot of the, not just rhetoric, but really a lot of the sort of public statements from elected leadership statewide has been that there's nothing that can be done to fill these federal funding gaps because the scale is just so large. And there was a certain strategic logic to making those claims 4 months ago, where, understandably, a lot of people at that level wanted to say that it would be a catastrophe and try to pressure the Congress, and especially New York's Republican congressional representatives, all of whom ended up voting for this, try to pressure them into thinking that this would be really bad for New York, and so they shouldn't do it. But now we've got the bill, and so there's no reason to say anymore that nothing can be done. But you might wonder how to even think about the question of what can be done. And sometimes, I would say even typically, people want to start that conversation with the question of taxes. Like, which taxes do we have? Which taxes should we impose? Can you come up with a new tax we can use to raise revenue? And that's not really the right way to approach the question. The right way to approach it is to think through the public finance issues here in a kind of big picture economic perspective. So how do we do that? First, let's look at the actual amount of money in the state budget. The state budget annually right now is about $250 billion. Of that, about $90 billion comes from federal funding. So this just shows you the sources of state revenue for last year. You can see we get about $120 billion in taxes, about $40 billion in other sorts of receipts like gaming taxes and fees and fines paid. We get just over $90 billion in federal funding, but most of that federal funding is on the health side. 75 of the 93 some odd billion dollars is Medicaid and the Essential Plan. The Essential Plan is the thing I mentioned at the beginning that is sort of Medicaid-like. It's not part of Medicaid, but it actually gives free health insurance to 1.6 million New Yorkers. So structurally, this is why so much of the impact of this federal fiscal situation is concentrated in state health funding. So normally if you hear about the budget, you'll read something like the budget is $250 billion. That is so many billions of dollars. How could we possibly afford it? But that's not really the way you think about state spending. You think about state spending by relating it to the economy in which that spending takes place. So this just shows you the growth in New York State's gross state product, which is basically like its state GDP, the total value of the economy over time. And the state economy has a total output of about $2.3 trillion. So any tax take, any amount of spending, it sort of exists essentially within this chart. And the state share of that budget, the state spends about $150 billion. So that's around 7% of the whole state economy. So that tells you something about the state's capacity to finance that level of expenditure. You might sort of cleverly say that, well, you have local taxes and city taxes, and that all adds in, and so you can't just look at the state side, and that's true. But if we put it all together, the state and the city and other localities, it comes out to about $300 billion in total taxes taken out of the economy, which is 13% of total state economic activity. So this is kind of the first frame to figure out how much, like, could you backfill those cuts? Can you come up with the $10 billion? And the answer is basically yes. If you increase the overall tax burden by under half of a percentage point, that would get you about $10 billion a year. Now there's a question of what instrument do you use? What's the right way to raise that revenue? But in the first instance, you should be thinking about the economy and tax bases, not tax instruments, because this is how you figure out whether the state has the capacity to generate the money to pay for those new costs. Once you get into the question of a tax instrument, you have to think about the principle that is really quite central to tax policy all over the world, at least going back maybe 80 years or so to the rise of the welfare state, where states really do generate a lot of tax revenue and spend a lot of tax revenue, because the reality of social programs is they're expensive. The federal government, almost half of the budget is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. People sometimes imagine that half of the budget is defense. It's about 15% of the budget, the federal budget, I mean. Those are really good programs. I strongly support those programs, but it is just important to recognize that it is expensive to have these broad forms of social provision. And so you need to be able to raise enough revenue to pay for them. And that normally means taxing a very large category of economic activity. That's what tax policy experts would call broad-based taxes. So our normal tax bases, and there are really only a few big ones, are consumption or sales, income, and then corporate profits to a lesser extent. But that's actually declined over time because fewer and fewer businesses are organized as corporations. And this shows you kind of how say just personal income relates to the state economy in total. I mentioned how the value of the whole state economy is about $2.3 trillion, and the value of all personal income is about $1.8 trillion. So this is really a good way to visualize what a broad tax base is. Now we have progressive income tax rates, so the rich pay more, but every year we raise about $75 billion just out of individual personal income, and it comes out of this tax base. This shows you personal consumption compared to gross state product. So the sales tax is a consumption tax, meaning it's imposed on end users when you buy something that you're not going to resell. And the value of all consumption statewide is about $800 to $900 billion. So again, this is another pretty good tax base. Now we do use both of these tax bases, but it's kind of to get you in a headspace to say, okay, like we're stuck with those, and then how do we work within them? The one issue with our sales tax, and this is, I think, pretty high on the list of directions that the state could go in thinking about new revenue measures, our sales tax only applies to goods. And that's intuitive to most of us, because if you were to pay a lawyer, you wouldn't expect sales tax, but if you were to buy some ice cream, you would expect to pay sales tax. That's not how it works in many other countries that just raise more revenue. So the dark blue on top is total consumption. The lighter blue on bottom is just consumption of goods. So that sort of shows you how much of that tax base you're leaving on the table by limiting the sales tax just to the sale of goods. So what could you actually do with this? Because what everybody ultimately wants to know is things like revenue estimates. And I have sort of shied away here from what has become the pretty common tax policy logic, at least in the state legislature, which is considering tax increases only on people who make many millions of dollars a year. And the reason is that it really pulls us away from that theme of broad-based taxation. It does create more sensitivity to behavioral impacts. Our research has shown that people really don't leave because of taxes, but the more that you concentrate your tax base on people who make over $10 million a year, the more you have something to worry about. And if we go back to the charts I showed at the beginning, we have to remember that federally, people who are in the top 10 to 20% are also doing quite well. You've seen continual tax cuts on those households making over $200,000, $250,000. And we can't afford those tax cuts. The cost of those tax cuts is really just undermining it's undermining our social programs. So you've basically, the rule is if you want stuff, you have to pay for it. And so here are the numbers. If you were to raise the personal income tax by just 1 percentage point on everyone making over $250,000, that's about $5 billion a year. So that gets you halfway to the current estimated federal funding gap. That would not even recover all of the, that would be less than a third of about the tax cut that population has gotten at the federal level. If you were going to impose a sales tax on services, the flip side of choosing a broad tax base is that a relatively low rate can still raise a lot of money. So if we were to extend it to cover services at a pretty low non-distortionary rate, say of just 1 percentage point, that gets you another $5 to $6 billion annually. So you could put those together and essentially solve the state's current fiscal problem permanently in terms of the effect of these federal funding cuts. If you want to do new services, you'd have to come up with other options, but this basically gets you to solving the current problem. The other thing that I like to throw in that's on a slightly different note, but also pretty important, is most businesses are just not organized as corporations, so very few businesses pay the corporate tax. But if you wanted to turn your business tax into more of a broad-based tax, you could do like a low rate business profits tax that you would apply just to all businesses. And that also gets you into the sort of $9 billion ballpark, which on its own could fix the current federal fiscal risks. So there are, I'll go to questions now. Strictly speaking, there are alternatives, but I think it's really important because we are very seriously today talking about how the state can actually come up with new revenue measures on a scale of $5 to $10 billion to take very seriously this broad-based idea and think about what that would mean in sort of more permanent terms. Okay. Oh, I think we have a very full chat. So I'm going to start to look through this and see what people are saying. I see something about New York Health Act. That's for another day. Most numbers, someone asked about the numbers in the charts. State budget stuff is annual. This is being recorded, so I'll post the recording, I'll post the slides, and then I'm going to release a paper probably tomorrow that has a written analysis of everything in here. Does FPI agree with the $750 million assessment by the state for the remainder of the fiscal year? It's sort of a yes and a no. We're also going to release something on that, but basically, some of the healthcare spending in the budget was actually treated as temporary, it was sort of treated as with the understanding that it could disappear. And so it doesn't mean that like the money isn't disappearing. It's just that for budgetary purposes, the state is able to say, oh, we never really counted in the first place, so it's not really going away. But it doesn't really change the sort of fiscal outcome. So their $750 million estimate of the current year cost accounts for some of those tricks that they were playing in the budget with what they knew actually were uncertain revenues. And that 750 million is, so again, it's current fiscal year. The state fiscal year goes from April to March. We're currently in fiscal year 26. So by March of next year, that would be their budgeting period for that $750 million loss estimate. Oh, and I meant to mention this, but someone brought up the inflation refund checks. There are two things I should add. First of all, the governor made a whole initiative out of spending $2 billion to write everybody a one-time check in this past budget. I think there's pretty strong bipartisan understanding now that that's not a good idea. So they should definitely recapture the inflation refund. But the other thing that's a little more sensitive is there was also a middle-class tax cut. So they decided to spend $1 billion, not just one time, but permanently reducing the income tax rate for people who make between $150,000 and $320,000. That we were very critical of. Nobody wants to oppose a tax cut for people in that income group, but I hope I've convinced you over the last 45 minutes that it's not fiscally sound and that it's better to be able to maintain the integrity of our healthcare and education programs than to give out little tax cuts. If somebody, I'm scrolling, I see some other stuff. Feel free to raise your hands if you want to jump in. Steve. Hi, Steve.
Hi, thank you as always, Nathan and FPI. I wanted to raise, because it did receive some positive response in chat, the actually passed, really politically doable, at least it was in Connecticut, um, savings that we could have to Medicaid if we went to their model of, yes, it's managed care, but it's a single statewide not-for-profit entity. And however much money New York State has, we can make the same amount of money go further by cutting out the made by Cuomo only model of let's have 25 different for-profit entities doing managed care across the state with some random mix of 2 to 12 entities in any given county. And let's get rid of all the benefits of managed care and give more and more money to the for-profits.
Yeah, that's not my area of expertise. Michael Kanukin, who's FPI's health policy director, knows a lot about that. And I think we would strongly agree that now is the time to find savings in the way that the state structures managed care. And another research project we have going on that we just released a report on yesterday, which actually relates to insurance premium increases in the small business market, is just focused on basically how to find other savings in healthcare costs, and in particular on the hospital pricing end. Hospitals are going to be in a lot of hospitals are going to be in a lot of trouble because we have a lot of distressed hospitals, and so there will really be a need to come up with more money to bail out hospitals. But I think part of that bargain is going to have to be getting serious about finding ways to avoid unnecessary cost increases.
Yeah. I would add, of course, some of us are still pushing New York Health Act as a now more than ever argument that Dick Gottfried makes. And another intermediate model to consider for hospital funding is several other states have experimented in various global funding models, albeit with
Yeah.
mixed success. There was a recent report out of Pennsylvania showing some pluses and minuses, but some of them went to that model during COVID because of the crisis in financing hospitals the way we currently do, and how COVID showed it's absurd.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like some sort of real paradigm shift in health finance is likely to be in the cards here. Frank DeLucia.
Hi, Nathan. Thank you very much. It's a very intelligent discussion. I'm glad you're doing this. Regarding I have two real areas of concern here. What, in terms of the pass-through tax, don't you believe that, first of all, it would be double taxation? That was the original reason for a pass-through entity. But don't you think that people would adjust to that by taking out more salaries and leaving practically nothing in those entities? Number one. Number two, what would be, I think the real way you really can't get out of paying this one would be, what would be, like, say, a 0.5% increase in the sales tax on goods instead of on services? How much would that do you have any idea what that number would be?
Give me 10 seconds.
You have 8 seconds left.
I think that would get you about $1 billion off the top of my head. Well, as a former tax lawyer, I love the question about pass-throughs. I think that, and somebody raised a question about this. So one thing that is worth understanding is, if you know anything about pass-through businesses, people typically think of those as small businesses. Like, I run a little restaurant, or like a tiny consulting service. But law firms, I mean, Frank knows this, but law firms are pass-through businesses. Most investment firms are pass-through businesses. So there is like a lot. You could sort of narrow it to be, you could do some small business exemption. Sometimes I worry about the implications of that. But directly to your question, I think that at least in the sort of most profitable firms, it's very hard to imagine how they would restructure so that what normally are profits distributions, say to like big law partners, all get turned into salary. There might be some adjustments, but I don't think the operating model would really permit that, but it's an interesting argument. Since I see one thing I want to address in the chat, someone says sales taxes are regressive. So this is sort of like this argument is like the heart and soul of so many tax and social policy debates, because in the US, this may surprise you, but our income tax system is actually pretty progressive by national standards, in the sense that the difference between a middle income earners tax rate and the sort of top bracket tax rate is bigger than it is in many other countries. So there's a big literature on and sorry, I should say this whole idea of regressivity, it has to do with how much of your income gets taken out in taxes. So an income tax generally places a higher burden on people who are higher earners. A sales tax generally places a relatively higher burden on people who are lower earners because they spend more of their money. So progressive policy advocates in the US have generally had a very strong focus on progressive income taxation in order to increase tax fairness. Anybody who's done a little bit of social policy knows that, somewhat ironically, most countries that have more generous social provision tend to rely more on regressive taxes. And it's because of that broad-based idea, basically, that you can raise a whole lot of money with a sort of small tax spread over the whole economy. And so on that model, the fairness or the progressivity you look for isn't really on the tax rate side, it's on the spending side. You say everybody pays tax, but the equity benefits really come from more generous social provision that disproportionately helps people who are low and middle income. Andrea Smith.
Nathan, thank you. And trying to stay focused on the revenue side of the question, but just raise when decisions are made about what to increase spending on, is there some category that's better than others? Like the 750 is primarily the Medicaid and the SNAP cuts, but there were also significant changes to subsidized loan forgiveness for people who are heading into behavioral health and healthcare and legal fields, and also a regulation that will cut the public service loan forgiveness program. These are very targeted to limiting people of low and middle income from being able to go into professions and work in public service. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, when you go back and recalculate whether the 750 is a good number, also keeping in mind things that we should be considering backfilling, like a social worker who is 7 months away from graduating and has reached the cap and can no longer borrow any more subsidized loans and is going to have to go to a loan shark to finish school. So those are some of the things that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, but I just wonder if there's some categories of what we should consider backfilling that we should be working on putting together for folks.
So it's a really great question. I'm sort of sorry to say that I think there are a few reasons why you maybe haven't heard anyone even try to answer that. The first is that when we talk about the state fiscal costs and the hits to the state budget, a lot of that is driven by what will be automatic increases in the state's liabilities. So we talk about the $2.7 billion in additional costs from essential plan reductions. That is not because the state has decided to fix the essential plan. A lot of people are still going to get kicked off the essential plan. It's because when those people get kicked off the essential plan, they will automatically be eligible for state-funded Medicaid, and the state is automatically going to have to pay for them to be on Medicaid. Similarly with the SNAP cost shifting. So even though a lot of this debate has taken place along the lines of, oh, we can't backfill it, it can't be done, there's nothing we can do, that argument is sort of starting in the wrong place, right? The state is going to have all these additional costs, even if it doesn't want to help anybody. And then it's going to have to decide how to handle them. Will it raise taxes? Will it find other places to cut? Because it can't necessarily cut in those places. So just to take the Medicaid example, all these immigrants who are on the essential plan are going to go onto Medicaid. The state cannot decide to find cost savings by kicking them off Medicaid. So people who don't think that they're going to be affected by these cuts will be affected, because to the extent that new revenue isn't coming in to fund those liabilities, like the savings will just be found elsewhere in the budget, and really nobody knows where. So that's the starting point for this analysis. And then what you would like to do is figure that problem out and then say, okay, what are some other state policy levers that we have to deal with the other problems that are going to impact New Yorkers but might not show up in the budget? Some stuff like maybe housing vouchers, like you said, this student loan stuff really came in sort of last minute, and became a big, I mean, it's crazy. You know what I think. But last minute, they really decided to stick it to student borrowers. So I would say that I think that's very sad and frustrating, also potentially interesting, because maybe you have to re-raise this old question of like, why is CUNY not free anymore, and what would it mean to invest in public universities in New York so that they can start to sort of make up some of that slack. But it would be much more lateral policy thinking, like what are some new ideas, as opposed to just the like dollar for dollar coming up with money kind of policy approach. Mia McDonald.
Yeah. Hey, Nathan, thanks so much for this. This was really helpful. I had two questions. One was just if there is precedent on the taxing pass-through businesses like corporations, if we've seen that done anywhere else. And then the second was just, I know you listed 3 options, and I'm wondering if there is a reason for listing those 3 rather than like some of the others that, we've heard floated over the past few years, like raising corporate taxes or a capital gains tax, if it's just because of the amount of revenue they raise, or if there are other reasons why we think these 3 are the best options.
Yeah, good questions. So wait, sorry, what was the first question? Something about the pass-through?
Oh, just if there's precedent for that.
Oh, yeah, I love that question because New York City actually does it. It's a little wonky, but it's called the unincorporated business tax. So anyone who's ever done business in New York City knows this. And they structure it. There's like a small tax on unincorporated business income. The thing that is also a little sort of exciting about that from a tax policy history perspective is basically you used to have this structure in the US where you could be a corporation and your corporation is limited liability. So the owners of the stockholders in the corporation are protected from liability for the corporation's acts, but the corporation pays the corporate tax. Or you could have a partnership where you get no corporate tax, but you're on the hook for the liabilities of the business. And that policy logic held up for a number of decades until actually the LLC was created by the state of Wyoming and then progressively broke down this policy logic. So today, it's not really advisable to set up a corporation, essentially, unless you want it to become publicly traded. You can get all the traditional benefits of limited liability that you got from a corporation, along with not paying the corporate tax by creating an LLC that's taxed as a partnership. And so it's actually created quite a large tax policy literature of people who are not progressives, actually, but they just say there's no real policy logic to this distinction anymore. And so really it would make more sense to have a kind of across the board way to tax businesses because that old structure broke down. All right, now I've said so much about that, Mia, that I forgot your second question.
No problem. That was really helpful. Thank you. The second was just, I know you listed 3 options, and I'm wondering
Oh,
if
yeah.
there is a reason you chose those over some
Yeah,
others.
it's maybe a reason and a half. The main is just that if you ever look at, people will ask like, hey, what are some tax options for New York City to do such and such? And they'll pull up an IBO report and it'll have like 17 options, but only 3 of them raise money. So it's sort of, you see a lot of like lists of things to change in the tax system, but there are very few things that raise money. So my goal is really to keep people focused on the taxes that raise revenue and that could reasonably raise a lot of revenue, even with low rate increases. No one's going to be happy about it, but sort of that's the only way it works. The corporate tax, I didn't really talk about it. It is in the cards. It's gotten like a little bit narrow, and it's also everybody's kind of go-to, so I didn't talk about it. It would definitely be a good candidate. It would probably be hard to get another $5 billion out of the corporate tax, realistically. Corporations got a huge tax cut in 2017, but you could increase, but would you double the corporate state tax rate? Maybe not. So I think at scale, it's good to add into the mix, but it's just a little bit narrower of a tax base. And then on other things, I think there are a lot of good ideas out there that would increase tax fairness. I think in terms of really generating money, it's a short list.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Oh, and Pete Nabozny asked a really good question. I don't know if he's still in the Zoom meeting, but said how much of this can be managed through more realistic revenue projections. One of the things that we've consistently drawn attention to over the last few years is that the state tends to sort of structurally underestimate its annual revenues in a way that, as budget people, you have to be a little sympathetic to, because you understand the state's desire not to overestimate how much money it can spend. And yet typically you see like a multi-billion-dollar annual surplus. I think there'd probably be, we've had really, just like the economy has been very weird the last few years. And so revenues have been kind of unpredictable in a way that led them to come in over predictions. But I think you'd be appropriately nervous about banking on that for more than a sort of small share of these needs. But it's definitely worth knowing that that's part of the equation. And if anything, it should sort of most feed into another thing that I didn't talk about that much, but it's really important, which is we should like immediately think of this as a short to medium term problem, right? The state has a lot in reserve. You can actively manage these cuts on a kind of 2 to 3 year basis by drawing down reserves, seeing how revenues turn out, and not really making any cuts. I think what you're likely to hear is, we're losing $750 million. We need to find $750 million in cuts today. Often in state budget debates, you get a very one-for-one logic. Somebody will say, I want to spend another dollar on a program. How can I raise $1 from taxes? Say it doesn't work that way. There's sort of slack in the budget. Things are flexible. And so that probably doesn't get you to the point of not worrying at all about the federal funding gaps, but we should all have a real sensitivity to some of that flexibility, and that in terms of the costs the state has forecast, they should not really be imposing meaningful cuts at that level. Sharon Shapiro.
Hi. My main concern is, and will always be, that people are movable. Okay. And yeah, I'm afraid of the corporate tax base moving to Florida, however they want to promote, come to my state.
Yeah.
So
So
that's why corporate tax cuts is is down on my favorite. First of all, I want to thank you, Nathan, for doing this presentation. It gave me comfort in my advocacy to see that there are ways to raise the money. And at the same time, the more we can lay off corporations to keep that tax base here and not moving out.
yeah, this is a very good question. And I like it because it allows me to talk about how the corporate tax actually works, which is if you're a corporation anywhere in the country, there's no real concept of headquarters or residence in state corporate taxation. Going back 10 years to the 2015 corporate tax reform, if you are a corporation anywhere in the country is taxed on its sales into New York. They call it market-based sourcing. So you're Walmart, you're in Arkansas, you sell a bunch of stuff into New York, and you get taxed by New York State on your profits from those sales to customers in New York. There used to be a different system, but the whole theory of that reform was we won't, quote unquote, penalize corporations for being located here. I don't like that word because taxes aren't penalties, but that's what they said. And that is how it works, that there's no disincentive for hiring people or having your offices in New York. So when people say, so there are sort of two migration or movement arguments. People say the corporations will move and people will move. Our research empirically about people shows that they don't move, but they could move and avoid tax. Corporations, it's just conceptually true that where they are located literally does not matter for how the tax works. So that is essentially just misinformation when people make that argument. All right, I think I'm not seeing any more questions or hands. So, oh, Malia?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you had touched on this, but I just wonder if you could say a few words about, the potential impact on waiver services with this budget cut.
Sorry, waiver services. I'm
So-
not going to be able to answer that.
It's okay, but just in New York State, we have waivers that are funded by Medicaid, and it's up for renewal in a couple of years.
Gotcha. Yeah. This is, there's that's definitely a Michael question. It's also written up in some of our Medicaid briefs, which you can find on our website. And if you can't, just email us and we'll get them to you. But there are different timelines on the different waiver renewals. And so it is part of the timing question of when does the funding loss happen? But I do not know the answers to those questions off the top of my head. Anne Erling.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering, I'm curious about the stock transfer tax. I noticed you didn't have that there, and I'm just wondering, what are the arguments against doing that? And how much would it bring in if it was?
Yeah. So someone's asking about the recording. I'm going to put all this stuff up right after we're done. So check back in an hour or two. It should all be up on the website. So the stock transfer tax is interesting and a bit of a tough one. I would say just in terms of like true tax policy, here are the concerns that I would have. So I'm just going to drop. There we go. I'm giving you our org info address that anybody should email if you have any questions. So the thing about a stock transfer tax is it's a very nice idea, but the stock transfer tax kind of dates, as you know, to a much earlier period where you had all these primary trades of the stock on the New York Stock Exchange. And so it works on I think it's like a 0.5% tax on shares worth over $100. And so that's supposed to sound like a small amount of money. Honestly, my concern is that a lot of trading today is high frequency trading. So, if you ever read a book about finance, and I mean, this is very distasteful, but the reality is they might make like a tiny, tiny amount of profit on every trade, but just do a ton of trades on a nanosecond basis at some high frequency trading shop. That's like a bad thing about the economy, but it's probably not something that we want to attack just in New York, because likely they would have no choice but to relocate their business in order for the business to exist. The policy concept that I think is at issue is generally you can sort of tax activities or you can tax profits. So you might want to tax like the profits of financial services firms. You wouldn't necessarily want to tax like every time they provide a financial service or every time they do a trade, because you're not really sure what the effects of that tax will be on the business. That's so sometimes it's estimated that that stock transfer tax would raise $14 billion. That's because it's currently sort of logged and rebated, so that's like a notional amount. But I think it's extremely hard to estimate what the real revenue would be, and it just gives you sort of economic distortionary concerns about industry responses. I think that, you know, the appeal of adopting a broad-based tax approach is you don't really have to worry so much about the distortionary effects. So let's say that, you know, people would freaking hate the idea of doing a services sales tax. But at 1%, you can be pretty confident that no one's going to change any of their business behavior because the tax rate is so low, right? Nobody's going to move out of New York. Nobody's going to stop doing business. Similar thing with the income tax. And so that's why I'm fairly sort of preachy about that concept, because it does insulate you from a lot of the worries people have about the business effects of tax increases. Frankie Herman.
Hi, good afternoon. This has been so helpful. My name is Frankie Herman. I'm a Medicaid attorney with the Urban Justice Center Mental Health Project. I'm wondering if you could kind of like read the tea leaves a little bit and let us know how politically viable you think that sort of like 3-point what you've been waiting for slide is, because there's logic and then there's politics, right?
Yep. Yeah. Well, here's what I can say about the tea leaves, which is I'm not necessarily a reader of the tea leaves, but you can see certain fundamental structural trends, right? And the sort of structural reality here is what's politically worse, having to raise taxes, which people think they don't like, but it happens sometimes, or having to come up with $5 billion of spending to cut out of the budget, right? Once that means closing hospitals, or making people go hungry because you can't afford to, you know, the state's share of SNAP costs, and then the hunger feeds into rising homelessness. I think that's a really hard political equation for anyone to figure out. And I would bet a fair amount of money that people in the state budgeting office have been freaking out, because this is not the normal year where you can say, well, we don't need any new programs, so we're not going to raise taxes. Like there's a very real policy challenge. And I think that the more that, you know, what I would hope, what is sort of the point of this meeting, I think the more that you can build some kind of vocal consensus around not just taxing billionaires, say, but you know, say support for some sort of broad-based tax, I think you may actually be able to put your finger on that scale. All right, anybody else? All right. Well, thanks for sticking through to 1:15. This was dense, but hopefully interesting and even fun, thrilling, perhaps.
Hi, Nathan. Oh,
Oh, hi.
I'm so sorry. I was just wondering, do you have any resources on how we could communicate this to like the masses of just like in very simple ways to kind of get more people on board, or is it more so like heavy research stuff?
I don't know that we have more stuff for the masses, though I'm open to producing that. You know, sometimes we work with partner organizations that want to do their own sort of political education on, say, more simplified talking points and explainers. And I'm always happy to kind of have small group discussions with people who want to understand it better so that they can teach. I do think that's really important. So if you want to do that, get in touch, and I'm happy to kind of discuss how it can be useful. And definitely, I'd say this was reasonably in depth, but I'm pretty happy to write talking points or try to get stuff really simplified.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.